When Carl Gustav Jung, the pioneering Swiss psychiatrist and psychoanalyst, devoted his life's work to understanding the deepest recesses of the human psyche, he uncovered what he considered to be the most dangerous psychological phenomenon that could manifest in any individual. This wasn't merely a clinical observation born from his therapeutic practice, but a profound warning that emerged from decades of studying both individual patients and the collective movements that had shaped human history. Jung believed that the most dangerous sign in a person was not overt aggression, not obvious malice, and not even calculated cruelty, but rather something far more insidious and potentially devastating: the complete unconsciousness of one's own shadow, coupled with the compulsive need to project that shadow onto others. To understand why Jung viewed this particular psychological configuration as so perilous, we must first delve deep into his conceptualization of the shadow archetype and its role in the human personality structure. The shadow, in Jungian psychology, represents all those aspects of ourselves that we find unacceptable, uncomfortable, or incompatible with our conscious self-image. These are not necessarily evil qualities, though they often include impulses toward aggression, selfishness, or cruelty. More fundamentally, the shadow contains everything we have learned to suppress, deny, or disown about ourselves in order to maintain our idealized self-concept and social acceptability. Every human being, according to Jung, possesses this shadow aspect as an inevitable consequence of psychological development and social conditioning. From early childhood, we learn which behaviors, thoughts, and emotions are deemed acceptable by our family, community, and culture, and which are met with disapproval, punishment, or rejection. Through this process of socialization, we gradually construct what Jung called the persona, our public face, the mask we wear in social interactions. Simultaneously, we banish the unacceptable aspects of our personality to the unconscious, where they form the shadow complex. The danger emerges not from the mere existence of the shadow, which Jung saw as inevitable and even potentially valuable when properly integrated, but from the complete unconsciousness of its presence and the psychological mechanisms that arise to defend against its recognition. When individuals become entirely disconnected from their shadow material, they lose the capacity for genuine self-reflection and honest self-assessment. They become convinced of their own moral superiority, their righteousness, and their fundamental goodness, while remaining blind to their own capacity for destructiveness, manipulation, or harm. This unconsciousness of the shadow creates what Jung observed to be a psychological pressure that must find release somewhere. Since the individual cannot acknowledge these unwanted aspects within themselves, they begin to see them everywhere else. This process, known as projection, becomes compulsive and pervasive. The person begins to identify enemies everywhere, constantly finding in others the very qualities they refuse to acknowledge in themselves. They become hypervigilant to the faults, weaknesses, and moral failings of those around them, while maintaining a stance of moral purity and righteousness about their own motivations and actions. Jung witnessed this dynamic playing out on both individual and collective levels throughout his lifetime, which spanned 2 world wars and numerous social upheavals. He observed how ordinary citizens could become swept up in mass movements driven by shadow projection, where entire groups of people became convinced of their own moral superiority while demonizing others as the embodiment of evil. The Nazi movement, which Jung witnessed firsthand, represented perhaps the most extreme example of collective shadow projection, where an entire nation projected its shadow onto specific minority groups, leading to unprecedented acts of systematic cruelty and destruction. What made this phenomenon particularly dangerous in Jung's view was its self-reinforcing nature. The more an individual projects their shadow onto others, the more convinced they become of their own righteousness, and the more justified they feel in taking increasingly extreme measures against those they perceive as threats. This creates a psychological feedback loop where moral blindness leads to increasingly immoral actions, all performed under the banner of righteousness and justice. The individual exhibiting this pattern typically presents themselves as highly moral, principled, and concerned with justice and righteousness. They may be pillars of their community, respected for their apparent integrity and strong moral convictions. They often position themselves as protectors of society, guardians of virtue, or defenders of important causes. This outward presentation makes them particularly dangerous because their destructive actions are clothed in moral authority and social respectability. Jung observed that such individuals often possess a peculiar combination of moral fervor and emotional coldness. They can speak passionately about justice and righteousness while simultaneously displaying a concerning lack of empathy for those they perceive as enemies or obstacles. They may advocate for harsh punishments, exclusion, or even violence against certain groups, all while maintaining that they are serving a higher moral purpose. Their capacity for rationalization becomes extraordinary, allowing them to justify almost any action as necessary for the greater good. The projection of shadow material typically follows predictable patterns. The individual will identify specific characteristics in others that they find particularly disturbing or threatening. These characteristics are often precisely those aspects of themselves that they most fear or despise. For example, someone who has repressed their own aggressive impulses may become obsessively concerned with the aggression of others, constantly seeing threats and violence where none may exist. Someone who has denied their own selfish tendencies may become fixated on the greed and self-interest of others, positioning themselves as selfless servants of the greater good, while pursuing their own interests with remarkable single-mindedness. The danger of this psychological configuration extends beyond the individual level, because such people often become leaders, influencers, or authority figures within their communities. Their apparent moral certainty and passionate conviction can be highly attractive to others who are struggling with their own moral confusion or psychological conflicts. They offer the seductive promise of simple answers to complex problems, clear distinctions between good and evil, and righteous justification for taking decisive action against perceived threats. Jung noted that these individuals often possess charismatic qualities that allow them to gather followers and build movements around their projected beliefs. They become magnetic to others who share similar psychological patterns, or who are seeking external authority to resolve their own internal conflicts. This creates the potential for collective shadow projection, where entire groups become united in their shared identification of enemies and their conviction of their own moral superiority. The historical consequences of such collective movements, driven by unconscious shadow projection, have been devastating. Jung witnessed how seemingly civilized societies could rapidly descend into barbarism when gripped by collective shadow projections. The witch trials of earlier centuries, various religious persecutions, political purges, ethnic cleansings, and genocides all follow similar psychological patterns where groups of people become convinced that certain others represent pure evil that must be eliminated for the good of society. What makes this pattern particularly insidious is that it often begins with legitimate concerns or real social problems. There may indeed be genuine issues that need to be addressed, real injustices that require correction, or actual threats that demand response. The danger lies not in the initial recognition of problems, but in the psychological process by which these legitimate concerns become vehicles for unconscious shadow projection. The original issues become secondary to the psychological satisfaction of having identified clear enemies and positioned oneself on the side of righteousness. Jung emphasized that the most dangerous individuals in this category are not those who are consciously evil or deliberately malicious. Conscious evil, while harmful, is at least transparent and can be recognized and opposed. The truly dangerous person is the one who commits evil while genuinely believing themselves to be good, who destroys lives while convinced they are saving society, who spreads hatred while proclaiming love, and who undermines the very values they claim to defend while maintaining absolute confidence in their moral authority. These individuals typically exhibit certain warning signs that Jung identified through his clinical work and historical observation. They demonstrate an unusual degree of moral certainty, showing little capacity for doubt, self-questioning, or acknowledgement of moral complexity. They tend to see the world in stark terms of good versus evil, with themselves and their group clearly positioned on the side of good. They show remarkable resistance to feedback or criticism, dismissing any challenges to their worldview as evidence of the moral corruption or ignorance of their critics. Their emotional responses tend to be disproportionate to the situations that trigger them. They may become intensely angry or agitated when confronted with viewpoints that challenge their projections, or when their authority or righteousness is questioned. This emotional intensity often masks a deep psychological fragility. Their entire sense of self depends on maintaining their projected worldview, and any threat to this projection feels like a threat to their fundamental identity. Jung also observed that such individuals often display a peculiar relationship with truth and reality. They may show remarkable intelligence and sophistication in some areas while maintaining obvious blind spots in others. They can be highly articulate in explaining and defending their beliefs, while simultaneously ignoring or dismissing evidence that contradicts their projections. Their capacity for selective perception becomes extraordinary, allowing them to see only information that confirms their existing beliefs while filtering out anything that might challenge their worldview. The interpersonal relationships of such individuals typically follow predictable patterns. They tend to surround themselves with people who reinforce their projections and validate their sense of righteousness. They may have difficulty maintaining close relationships with anyone who challenges their worldview or refuses to participate in their projections. Their relationships often become instrumentalized. People are valued primarily for their utility in supporting the individual's projected beliefs or advancing their cause, rather than for their inherent worth as human beings. Jung noted that family members and close associates of such individuals often suffer particular harm because they are closest to the source of the projection and have the most difficulty escaping its influence. Children of such parents may grow up with distorted understandings of morality, reality, and human relationships. Spouses and partners may find themselves either drawn into the projection system or subjected to increasing pressure, manipulation, or abuse when they resist participation. The professional and social consequences of unconscious shadow projection can be extensive. Such individuals may abuse positions of authority, whether as parents, teachers, managers, religious leaders, or political figures. They may use their influence to punish those who disagree with them, reward those who support their projections, and gradually create environments where their distorted worldview becomes normalized and reinforced. They may initiate conflicts, perpetuate divisions, and prevent resolution of problems, because maintaining external enemies is psychologically necessary for their internal stability. Jung emphasized that recognizing this pattern requires understanding the difference between genuine moral concern and projected shadow material. Genuine moral concern typically includes elements of self-reflection, humility, compassion for human fallibility, and recognition of moral complexity. It acknowledges that good people can make mistakes, that evil can masquerade as good, and that moral judgment requires careful consideration of context, motivation, and consequences. Genuine moral concern also includes the capacity for self-criticism and the willingness to examine one's own motivations and actions with the same scrutiny applied to others. In contrast, shadow projection masquerades as moral concern, but lacks these qualities of genuine moral reflection. It tends to be characterized by absolute certainty, harsh judgment of others combined with lenient self-assessment, and a notable absence of empathy for those identified as enemies. It often includes elements of grandiosity, the belief that one has special insight, authority, or responsibility to judge and punish others. It may also include paranoid elements, with the individual perceiving themselves as surrounded by enemies or engaged in cosmic battles between good and evil. The treatment and management of individuals exhibiting extreme unconscious shadow projection presents significant challenges for families, communities, and therapeutic professionals. Jung recognized that such individuals are typically highly resistant to therapeutic intervention because acknowledging the existence of their shadow would threaten their fundamental sense of identity and worldview. They may seek therapy or counseling, but often with the goal of gaining validation for their projections or finding more effective ways to combat their perceived enemies, rather than achieving genuine self-understanding. Successful therapeutic intervention, when possible, requires extremely skillful approaches that avoid directly challenging the individual's projections while gradually creating opportunities for self-reflection and shadow integration. This process can take years and requires the individual to develop sufficient ego strength and support systems to tolerate the anxiety and confusion that naturally arise when long-held projections begin to dissolve. For family members and communities dealing with such individuals, Jung emphasized the importance of maintaining clear boundaries while avoiding becoming drawn into the projection system. This often means refusing to participate in the demonization of the individual's chosen enemies, while also not directly challenging their projections in ways that might escalate conflict or persecution. It requires a delicate balance of compassion for the individual's psychological suffering, while protecting oneself and others from the harmful consequences of their projected beliefs. Understanding this psychological pattern also has important implications for how we structure societies and institutions to minimize the potential for collective shadow projection. Jung advocated for educational systems that emphasize critical thinking, self-reflection, and psychological awareness. He believed that individuals who understand their own capacity for shadow projection are far less likely to become caught up in collective movements driven by such projections. The early warning signs of developing unconscious shadow projection often manifest in subtle ways that can be easily overlooked or rationalized away. Jung observed that the process typically begins with an increasing rigidity in thinking patterns, where the individual gradually loses the capacity for nuanced understanding and begins to view complex issues in increasingly simplified, black-and-white terms. This cognitive rigidity often accompanies a growing intolerance for ambiguity, uncertainty, or multiple perspectives on important issues. One of the earliest indicators Jung identified was a shift in the individual's emotional responses to disagreement or challenge. While healthy individuals can engage with opposing viewpoints with curiosity, interest, or at most mild frustration, those beginning to exhibit shadow projection patterns show disproportionate emotional reactivity to any questioning of their beliefs or perspectives. They may become intensely angry, defensive, or agitated when their opinions are challenged, even in casual or academic contexts. This emotional intensity often surprises others and may seem completely out of proportion to the situation that triggered it. Another early warning sign involves changes in the individual's relationship with doubt and self-questioning. Jung noted that psychologically healthy individuals maintain some capacity for self-doubt and are able to question their own motivations, decisions, and beliefs when presented with new information or when their actions produce unexpected consequences. Those developing unconscious shadow projection gradually lose this capacity for self-reflection, becoming increasingly certain of their own righteousness and increasingly suspicious of their own doubts as signs of weakness or corruption. The language patterns of such individuals also begin to shift in characteristic ways. Jung observed that their speech becomes increasingly populated with moral absolutes, dramatic metaphors of good versus evil, and language that dehumanizes or demonizes those with whom they disagree. They may begin to use warfare metaphors to describe ordinary social or political disagreements, speaking of battles, enemies, threats, and the need for vigilance against evil forces. Their vocabulary becomes increasingly polarized, with fewer neutral or nuanced descriptive terms and more words that carry strong moral or emotional charges. Jung also noted changes in these individuals' relationships with information and evidence. They begin to show increasing selectivity in what information they consider credible or relevant, gradually developing elaborate criteria for dismissing any evidence that contradicts their developing worldview. They may become devoted to particular information sources while rejecting others, not based on objective evaluation of reliability or accuracy, but based on whether the sources support their projected beliefs. Their critical thinking skills, which may be quite sophisticated in other areas, become notably impaired when dealing with topics related to their projections. The social relationships of individuals exhibiting early shadow projection patterns also undergo characteristic changes. Jung observed that they begin to sort their relationships increasingly based on ideological agreement rather than personal affinity, shared interests, or mutual respect. They may become uncomfortable or irritated with friends or family members who don't share their growing convictions, and they may begin to seek out new relationships with people who validate and reinforce their projected beliefs. Their conversations increasingly center around their areas of projection, and they may show decreased interest in or patience for topics that don't relate to their growing obsessions. Perhaps most significantly, Jung noted that these individuals begin to show a subtle but growing sense of specialness or grandiosity about their role in addressing whatever issues have become the focus of their projections. They may begin to see themselves as particularly insightful, especially moral, or uniquely positioned to recognize and combat the threats they perceive. This sense of special mission or calling often provides psychological satisfaction that reinforces the projection pattern and makes it increasingly difficult for the individual to question their beliefs or consider alternative perspectives. Jung emphasized that these early warning signs are important precisely because intervention is most likely to be successful during the early stages of shadow projection development. Once the pattern becomes fully established and begins to provide significant psychological satisfaction and social identity, it becomes much more resistant to change. Early intervention requires delicate handling, as direct confrontation of the developing projections often backfires and accelerates the process rather than interrupting it. Effective early intervention, according to Jung, focuses not on challenging the content of the individual's beliefs, but on gently encouraging the psychological processes that support healthy shadow integration. This might involve encouraging the person to examine their own motivations and reactions, helping them reconnect with their capacity for empathy and nuanced thinking, or providing opportunities for them to encounter diverse perspectives in non-threatening contexts. Jung was particularly interested in the role of creative expression and symbolic work in preventing and addressing shadow projection. He believed that engagement with art, literature, mythology, and other forms of symbolic expression could help individuals recognize and integrate their shadow material in ways that direct psychological analysis might not achieve. Creative activities provide a safe space for exploring darker aspects of the psyche without the threat of immediate moral judgment or social consequences. The practice of what Jung called active imagination, deliberately engaging with unconscious material through guided fantasy, artistic expression, or symbolic dialogue, can serve as a powerful antidote to shadow projection. By creating opportunities for individuals to recognize and dialogue with their own rejected aspects, active imagination helps prevent the unconscious accumulation of shadow material that eventually seeks expression through projection onto others. Jung also emphasized the importance of developing what he termed psychological mindedness, the capacity to understand one's own psychological processes and recognize the subjective nature of one's perceptions and reactions. Psychologically minded individuals are more likely to ask themselves questions like, "What might this strong reaction tell me about myself?" rather than simply assuming that their emotional responses accurately reflect external reality. This capacity for self-reflection serves as a natural protection against unconscious projection. Educational approaches that emphasize critical thinking, media literacy, and psychological awareness can also serve preventive functions. Jung advocated for educational systems that teach individuals to recognize propaganda techniques, understand the psychology of persuasion, and develop skills for evaluating information objectively. However, he emphasized that purely intellectual approaches are insufficient if they don't also address the emotional and unconscious factors that make individuals susceptible to projection in the first place. The role of community and social support in preventing destructive shadow projection cannot be overstated in Jung's analysis. Individuals embedded in healthy communities with diverse perspectives, open dialogue, and mutual respect are less likely to develop extreme projection patterns. Conversely, individuals isolated from diverse viewpoints or embedded in communities that reinforce their projections are at much higher risk for developing dangerous patterns. Jung observed that certain life circumstances and stressors can increase vulnerability to shadow projection. Periods of significant personal stress, trauma, or life transition can destabilize an individual's psychological equilibrium and make them more susceptible to finding external explanations for their internal distress. Economic hardship, social displacement, health crises, or major life losses can all create psychological conditions that make projection more appealing as a way of managing overwhelming feelings. Understanding these vulnerability factors is important for both individual prevention and social policy. Communities experiencing widespread stress, inequality, or rapid change may be particularly susceptible to collective shadow projection movements. Addressing underlying social conditions that create psychological vulnerability can serve as an important form of collective prevention. Jung also explored the role of spiritual and religious development in either preventing or exacerbating shadow projection tendencies. Genuine spiritual development, in Jung's view, involves increasing self-awareness, humility, and compassion, qualities that naturally counteract shadow projection. However, he also observed that religious involvement could sometimes provide a sophisticated framework for projecting shadow material onto religious enemies or spiritual outcasts. The key distinction lies in whether religious or spiritual involvement increases or decreases the individual's capacity for self-reflection and empathy. The process of shadow integration that Jung advocated as the ultimate solution to projection requires considerable courage and psychological resources. It involves gradually acknowledging and accepting those aspects of ourselves that we have previously rejected or denied. This process is inherently anxiety-provoking, because it threatens our idealized self-image and requires us to confront our capacity for thoughts, feelings, and actions that we find disturbing or unacceptable. Shadow integration doesn't mean acting on destructive impulses or abandoning moral principles. Rather, it means acknowledging that we contain the full range of human possibilities and that our moral choices are meaningful precisely because we have the capacity for both good and evil. This recognition typically leads to increased humility, greater empathy for human frailty, and a more nuanced understanding of moral complexity. Jung found that individuals who successfully integrate significant amounts of their shadow material often become natural antidotes to collective shadow projection movements. Their awareness of their own capacity for destructiveness makes them skeptical of claims to moral purity, and their comfort with psychological complexity helps them resist simplified explanations for complex problems. They often become valuable voices for moderation and reflection in communities becoming polarized by projection dynamics. The therapeutic approaches Jung developed for working with shadow projection emphasize patience, indirect methods, and respect for the individual's psychological defenses. Direct confrontation of projections typically increases defensiveness and can strengthen the projection pattern. Instead, effective therapeutic work focuses on creating conditions where individuals can gradually discover their projections for themselves through their own experience and reflection. Dream work occupies a central place in Jung's approach to shadow integration. Dreams often present shadow material in symbolic form that bypasses the ego's defensive mechanisms. By learning to work with their dreams, individuals can begin to recognize and dialogue with rejected aspects of themselves in a relatively safe psychological space. Dream figures that the dreamer finds particularly disturbing or threatening often represent shadow projections that are ready for conscious integration. Jung also emphasized the value of examining our strongest emotional reactions to others as potential indicators of our own projections. When we find ourselves having intense negative reactions to particular individuals or groups, especially reactions that seem disproportionate or unusually persistent, this may indicate that we are encountering our own rejected qualities in projected form. This doesn't mean that everyone we dislike represents a projection, but intense and persistent negative reactions deserve careful self-examination. The role of feedback from trusted others is crucial in recognizing our own projection patterns. Jung noted that friends, family members, or therapeutic professionals who know us well can sometimes recognize our projections more easily than we can ourselves. However, receiving such feedback requires considerable ego strength and genuine openness to self-examination. Creating relationships where honest feedback is possible and welcomed serves as an important protection against unconscious projection. Collective approaches to addressing shadow projection involve creating social structures and cultural norms that promote self-reflection, diversity of thought, and recognition of moral complexity. Jung advocated for democratic institutions that include checks and balances specifically designed to prevent the concentration of power in the hands of individuals prone to projection. He also supported educational and cultural initiatives that help people recognize and resist propaganda and mass manipulation. The media's role in either promoting or combating shadow projection patterns deserves particular attention in Jung's analysis. Media that consistently presents complex issues in simplified, morally charged terms, that demonizes particular groups, or that appeals primarily to fear and anger can contribute to collective projection dynamics. Conversely, media that promotes nuanced analysis, presents multiple perspectives, and encourages self-reflection can serve protective functions. Jung's understanding of the most dangerous psychological sign ultimately points toward both individual and collective responsibility for psychological health. At the individual level, It requires ongoing commitment to self-awareness, honesty about our own motivations and reactions, and willingness to confront uncomfortable truths about ourselves. At the collective level, it requires creating communities and institutions that support psychological health and resist the appeal of simplified solutions to complex problems. The urgency of Jung's warning about unconscious shadow projection has only increased in our contemporary world, where rapid communication technologies can amplify projection patterns and spread them across vast populations almost instantaneously. Social media platforms and digital echo chambers can create conditions where projection patterns are reinforced and intensified rather than challenged or moderated. Understanding and addressing these dynamics has become crucial for maintaining stable, healthy societies. Yet Jung's analysis also offers hope. By understanding these psychological patterns, we can learn to recognize them in their early stages and take steps to address them before they reach their most destructive potential. Through commitment to self-awareness, cultivation of empathy and psychological complexity, and creation of communities that support healthy development, we can work to prevent the most dangerous manifestations of the human shadow while still honoring the full complexity and potential of human nature. The path forward requires both individual courage in facing our own shadows and collective wisdom in creating structures that support psychological health and integration for all members of society.